Soweto is a place where for much of my lifetime, hearing the word Soweto was shorthand for the gross unfairness and inequality of the old South Africa. And thus it is truly wonderful to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you at the Soweto campus of the University of Johannesburg. It's always a pleasure myself to come back to a lecture theatre where I spent much of my own life meeting, speaking and listening to students. So may I express my sincere thanks to the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Rensburg, for welcoming me to this marvellous campus. I would also like to thank Dr. Mekwe, Executive Director for Internationalization, and Professor Landsberg, as well as their staff, for their assistance in organising today's address. Additionally, I wish to thank Dr. Manyaka for his efforts in coordinating the logistics and other matters. And I would like to express my thanks to the student leaders at the campus who have supported the efforts of the university staff to make today's events happen. The great novelist V.S. Naipaul is, as a grandson of an Indian immigrant born in Trinidad, an astute observer of the wider post-colonial conversation to which Ireland, South Africa, and some other countries have contributed a distinctive voice. In his powerful novel set in Africa, A Bend in the River, he opens by stating, "The world is what it is. Men who are nothing, who allow themselves to become nothing, have no place in it." This is a bleak and challenging statement, written in the late 1970s, when there was much to feel bleak about here on this continent, and especially in South Africa. At one level, Naipaul is of course right. The world is what it is. But perhaps the key point, and I can think of nowhere better than Soweto to make this observation, is that people can change this. We can change our world. We can shape it and make it better, more equal and more just. And if I might borrow from another writer, Raymond Williams, who in his last message to us, his last public appearance said, "Be the arrow, not the target." And he suggested, it is when inevitabilities are questioned that you have taken your first small steps towards freedom. Men and women here in Soweto and in towns and villages all over this country, many of which, like Sharpeville, are burned into our moral memory. They fought for a free South Africa, a fairer and more equitable, a more just South Africa. They, to use Naipaul's idiom, did not allow themselves to be treated as nothing. They stood up for their personal worth, their rights and their dignity, and often paid a heavy price. I think, therefore, that it is highly appropriate here in this historic place, which has borne witness to some of the most challenging and significant events in recent South African history, to reflect on 20 years of democracy and freedom and the decades of struggle that preceded it. Such reflection also has relevance and great significance for Ireland, as we are observing a decade of commemoration marking the events from 1911 to 1921. Years that included the First World War that brought death and destruction to Europe and Africa, and our own struggle for self-determination and the emergence of an independent Ireland just over 90 years ago. The story of the Irish and their contribution to South Africa is as rich as it is complex. It is a human story, but as with all human stories, it is one of sacrifice and contradiction. Today there are upwards of 30,000 Irish citizens living in South Africa, some of whom are recent arrivals, but then many more who can trace their ancestry back much farther. It is a story of colonized and colonizer, of those seeking riches and those providing succor and education to all. It is a story of struggle and of the fight for freedom in Ireland and South Africa. In 1814, the Cape Colony was ceded by the Dutch to the British, and this period saw the earliest Irish arrivals as part either of the colonial administration or army. Ireland itself had been formally joined to the United Kingdom in 1801, though in effect having been ruled at least in part as a colony since the 12th century. The history of the Irish in South Africa might well have been different, of course, had the ship Neptune been allowed to disembark in Table Bay in 1849. The ship was carrying some 300 prisoners, many of whom were Irish political prisoners, following a failed rebellion against British rule in the previous year. The intention had been to establish a penal colony in the Cape. However, following a furious campaign by residents of the Cape, the plan was abandoned, and the Neptune instead sailed on to Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania. Instead, a rather different cohort of Irish men and women was to make its mark in this country. It has often been said that our missionaries have been ambassadors for Ireland long before Ireland became an independent state. And this is especially true in Africa. Wherever they have been, in addition to providing for spiritual needs, they have built schools and clinics in some of the most challenging of environments. South Africa has been no different. The first, Bishop Patrick Griffith, a Jesuit originally from Limerick, the county of my birth, arrived in Cape Town in 1838. The following year he purchased a site on which St. Mary's Cathedral now stands. From there, Irish missionaries moved to other parts of the Western Cape and to Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. With the discovery of gold and diamonds, there was further expansion to Johannesburg and Kimberley. Today, there are still large numbers of Irish priests and nuns all over South Africa. Most were here throughout the years of struggle, when they continued to provide health care and education in some of the most disadvantaged and oppressed communities. Descendants of Irish immigrants have also played a significant role in the religious life of South Africa and in the struggle against apartheid. Foremost of these is the late Archbishop of Durban, Dennis Hurley, who in another connection of sorts lived on Robben Island as a young boy, where his father was stationed as a lighthouse keeper. The discovery of gold and diamonds saw a new wave of immigration to South Africa, and it should be no surprise that some 6,000 Irish came to seek their fortunes here. That number included many who would go on to campaign for Irish independence from Britain, including Arthur Griffith and John MacBride. During the Anglo-Boer Wars, there was much sympathy from Irish nationalists for the Boer cause, with many seeing the Boer campaign as a proxy for their own campaign for home rule for Ireland. 2 units of an Irish brigade, numbering about 600 men, fought with the Boer armies. But at the same time, underlining the complexities of the time, a much greater number of Irish, some 30,000, were fighting in the British Army. Later, relations between our nations, of course, were friendly in the first half of the 20th century. The iniquities of the apartheid system introduced in 1948 did not have an immediate impact on Irish attitudes towards South Africa. But opinions began to harden, especially after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, the Rivonia trial in 1963 and 1964 led to a campaign in Ireland for the release of political prisoners in South Africa. The shift in attitudes took on real momentum, however, in 1964 with the foundation of the Irish anti-apartheid movement by my good friend, the late Kader Asman. Professor Asman made a huge contribution to human rights in Ireland, of course, north and south. He played an important part in the formation of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and he was one of the founders of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties in 1976. He was a professor of law for 27 years at Trinity College in Dublin, specialising in human rights, international law and labour law. Kader, with his wife Louise, was at the heart of the struggle against apartheid, and they galvanised opinion in Ireland. They garnered support from across the political spectrum and beyond. It was often a struggle, managed out of the Asmal household and underpinned by dedicated volunteers. The movement campaigned to isolate apartheid South Africa at all levels, including sporting and cultural. There was an early success with these campaigns, as a succession of first Irish playwrights refused to allow their work to be performed in South Africa. The Springbok rugby tour to Ireland in 1970 was a pivotal moment, building huge momentum in Ireland and intersecting with our own new sense of determination on civil rights in Northern Ireland. While the matches went ahead, the tour was marked by huge protests against the Springbok and indeed Irish teams for taking part and against the apartheid regime. I clearly recall myself being outside that game with the late Dr. Noel Brown, with the rain pouring down on us, and may I say, people who travelled past us to go into the game weren't exactly polite on occasion. It is then, when I think back, I recall how different it was to convince some sections of our cause, based as it was on human rights. But the struggle against apartheid around the world, including Ireland, was often epitomised by protests against such tours by Springbok teams in defiance of the international community's efforts to isolate South African international teams of that time. Post-apartheid, rugby has become a great connection between our two countries, with the mighty Springbok being very welcome and indeed formidable visitors to Ireland, though perhaps not as formidable to us as they once were. For people of my generation, the struggle against apartheid was the great defining moral argument of the second half of the 20th century. It was an issue which united people from Dublin to Durban. Having seen peace return to Europe and the birth of what we know today as the European Union, apartheid seemed to us one of the great obscenities facing the world. The utterly repugnant idea that one's race should predetermine one's prospects or rights in life needed to be fought. May I tell you just one short story of how that cause reached into the working people of Ireland. It is a story that illustrates what the impact of this injustice had in my own country on that one small group of people. In July 1984, just over 30 years ago, a group of workers, mainly young women, in a supermarket in Ireland refused to handle produce imported from South Africa. For this refusal they were suspended, thus marking the beginning of what would be a 3-year battle by 12 determined and brave workers. Their principled stance eventually led our government to ban South African goods from being sold in Ireland, and this ban remained in place until the end of the apartheid regime. By their action, these young women, these strikers, ordinary working women, highlighted the injustice of life in South Africa for the great majority of our people and forced the government to act. They thereby illustrated a point perhaps most eloquently made by the famous Irish statesman and writer Edmund Burke over 200 years ago. Nobody made a greater mistake than he or she who did nothing because they could only do a little. This is the point that those striking supermarket workers were making. The actions of millions more around the world to confront the moral outrage that was apartheid. Those who marched or boycotted rugby games or refused to buy South African goods, all in their own way contributed to the worldwide wave of change and transformation that eventually helped South Africans to liberate themselves. Kader Asmal's contribution went beyond fighting the good fight in Ireland in the way that I have described. He was also preparing to build a new South Africa. As a member of the ANC's Constitutional Committee, along with Albie Sachs, who went on to become a Justice of the Constitutional Court, he drafted the Bill of Rights in the kitchen of his home in Foxrock, Dublin in 1988. That Bill of Rights, which was subsequently incorporated into the new South African Constitution, was a truly seminal document and was an essential element in the transition to democracy and the drafting of a new constitution. And when he returned, Cara was not finished there. When he returned to South Africa, he became Minister for Water Affairs in South Africa's first democratic government, and later Minister for Education, where among his initiatives was the launching in 2001 of the South African History Project, which, as he put it, was to promote and enhance the conditions and status of the learning and teaching of history in the South African schooling system, with the goal of restoring its material position and intellectual purchase in the classroom. Archbishop Desmond Tutu has remarked that what we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. Nevertheless, rightly, Professor Asmal ensured the central role of history in the school curriculum. And I am delighted that the Irish government has honoured the contribution that Cadre has made to Ireland and South Africa by establishing the Cadre Asmal Fellowship Programme. Each year we intend to send 10 students to Ireland to pursue master's level studies in the areas of business management, food science, agriculture and nutrition, international development and public administration. As part of this programme, and in particular recognition of his contribution to law, in cooperation with the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, we have reserved one fellowship in international law at Cadre Asmal's old university, Trinity College, Dublin. Applications for the 2015-16 academic year are already open. They're still open. And I encourage and challenge students here to look at the programme and to consider studying with us in Ireland. I am, of course, in South Africa for the second time in 12 months, the last time to honour that joint among men, Nelson Mandela, a man whose personal story of sacrifice and statesmanship remains one of the most powerful and moving of the 20th century. I was privileged, along with those brave women who risked their livelihoods to strike, to attend his funeral here last year, in the company of so many world leaders, and to pay tribute to the outstanding international statesman of our generation. Nelson Mandela belongs to South Africa, but also to the world, to all people fighting against injustice, and he truly belongs to the ages. And I think he would say now, in other matters that are international, to which I will turn in a moment, he would, I think, favour a new activism that is radical, informed, research-based, and above all, as he proved, dialogical. I think Mandela and those who fought apartheid and created a new state also helped us in ending the violent sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland. All sides learned lessons from your experience, and often in private unannounced visits to your country, where enemies could face each other and talk and begin to explore pathways to peace and justice. For example, in 2000, Cyril Ramaphosa, former Secretary General of the ANC and now Deputy President, together with Martti Ahtisaari, former President of Finland, were appointed to work on weapons decommissioning in Northern Ireland. And this process was crucial in the building of trust between the two communities in Northern Ireland. It was an important step on the path to the decommissioning of the Provisional IRA and the subsequent establishment of the devolved power-sharing institutions in Northern Ireland that continue to provide peace and stability there. So we remain extremely grateful for Mr. Ramaphosa's personal contribution to the Northern Ireland peace process, but also to the powerful example of reconciliation provided by your leaders and your people. This year marks the 20th anniversary of that first democratic election in South Africa and the subsequent establishment of its first freely elected government under President Mandela. Since the advent of democracy in South Africa, Ireland has been a strong supporter of the process of transformation. In 1994, Irish Aid, which is our overseas development agency of the Government of Ireland, began a programme of support to South Africa that continues to this day and will continue. In the 20 years since democracy, Ireland has provided support to South Africa's democratic institutions, to the social sectors, and to sustainable rural livelihoods through local economic development. In partnership with you, We have assisted in the areas of education, gender-based violence, health, water and sanitation, and of course HIV and AIDS. We are currently also supporting economic growth through the Department of Trade and Industry strategy to develop special economic zones through capacity building in the training of nurses and in support for training in commercial law. We are committed to continuing that support and to working with you in the challenge, a challenge we face ourselves, to build inclusive, participatory, transformational and sustainable economic growth. As we reflect on the achievements of 20 years of democracy in South Africa, we find ourselves asking a very basic question. How can individual nations achieve such social and economic goals in an increasingly globalized and interdependent world? I think this is incredibly important. When we use this phrase, globalization, we must ask ourselves whether what is intended and aspired to is a globalized set of consumers, or is it some globalization that can carry the important burden of ethics, that can redefine interdependency to a relationship that is ethical. The impact of climate change, for example, and the depletion of the natural resource base on which economic development is based are already leading to changes in the way that economies are developing. And I remain, as a head of state, very concerned, as if you like, how much power has been leached from parliaments, and also how exposed so many countries seeking to reduce inequality are themselves disrupted regularly by externalities that are sourced in speculative capital rather than productive capital. So over the next decades, we are going to see a process of economic transformation, which will affect the value of basic assets, such as land, water and forests. The prices and markets for many commodities will change radically as new, more efficient technologies develop and as cleaner, renewable sources of energy replace traditional fossil fuels. It is universally accepted that poor people and poor countries are most at risk and already are suffering most from the impacts of climate change. This, however, does not mean that efforts to slow, halt and reverse climate change will necessarily benefit them. We must acknowledge then that the very necessary move to more environmentally sustainable economic models involves both risks and opportunities for poor people. Proponents of green growth see the transformation to sustainability as an opportunity to renew and accelerate economic growth. Undoubtedly, private corporations and countries are already moving to become market leaders in new technologies and to secure control over the markets and assets that will be critical to sustainability and the key future growth sectors in national and global economies. However, there is the danger that in processes of economic transformation, the greatest benefits accrue to those who are best positioned to take advantage, those who already have greater control over assets, wealth and political processes. I suggest as well, as I am in a university, that we are challenged, universities are challenged all over the world to look at what they teach as economics. They must ask the question, are we teaching that subject or any of the social sciences in a pluralist way? Why is it, for example, that we are stuck with one model, one instrument, within a declining hegemonic model that is based on an assumption of the rationality of free markets? And again, those of us who are interested in philosophy must surely consider the last 30 years, when that most powerful of concepts, freedom, became reduced to the freedom of the marketplace, the freedom to be able to operate without any intervention from the state at all. When I was the age of young students here, and when I was attending university for the first time, one studied the history of the subject, and there was one outstanding feature. Even Adam Smith himself, we must remember, before The Wealth of Nations, 7 years earlier, published The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was an economics located in a philosophical system that could, as I have said, carry the burden of ethics. And this is, of course, what we need to do now. We need new thinking and new pluralist teaching. And we need new models that will in turn generate different policy options. It does not have to be so that we are stuck with that which has been drawn from a failed paradigm. The shift to sustainability of which I've been speaking, if managed ethically and fairly, offers the possibility of making economies more inclusive and of directing new economic opportunity towards people who are currently excluded from economic growth and prosperity. It is perhaps a time to think again of the difference between the economics of needs and the economics of insatiable wants. It is useful to draw a distinction between inequality of consumers or inequality of rights and dignity. I think we have to reconceive and we have to reconnect ethics, the economy, and ecological responsibility together. But this will not just happen. Poverty reduces will not just follow the market process. Across Africa, we've seen for more than a decade now some of the highest growth rates in the world. Yet the numbers of hungry people remain persistently high, and some of the most basic Millennium Development Goals are still out of reach. And internationally, even those who are in the centre and right of centre in their economic thinking, as if that had any force, in fact are beginning to realise that gross domestic product, GDP, is no longer an adequate measure of human welfare. We have spent the last generation demonstrating that economic growth alone does not necessarily or naturally improve the position of the poor. And as we tackle climate change, we must not make a similar mistake of assuming that what is good for the environment is automatically good for poor people. To do so would risk developing policies that might achieve greater environmental sustainability while failing to reduce or address poverty. And in the forthcoming debates about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we must instead bring together sustainability and poverty reduction as overarching goals. This will require concerted political will to put in place active and responsive policies that have the specific purpose of ensuring that the transformation to sustainability prioritizes benefits for the poorest and most marginalized and vulnerable people. And this involves making clear choices. For example, ensuring poor people's rights over land, instead of facilitating acquisition by external investors. There have been transfers of land greater than the area of France transferred to private sectors in some parts of Africa. It involves opting for hundreds of thousands of small-scale energy systems which can provide energy in the most remote communities, rather than investing in a few big-ticket hydro or clean power coal stations that will serve only those already connected. It will include guiding investments and regulating markets in areas such as biofuels and carbon sequestration, so that they provide livelihoods for poor people, rather than increasing competition for the assets that these people depend on. It will require investing in and supporting innovation in the livelihood technologies of poor households to increase resilience to climate change and resource efficiency, rather than seeing sustainability as a technological import from industrialized countries. It will mean managing natural resources to prioritize jobs and value addition within the economy, reinvestment of profits and sustainable public finances, rather than just going for growth and ending up with an underpriced and overexploited extractive industry sector. And it will involve directing climate change finance to the poorest and most vulnerable households. These are not simply policy options. They are, I believe myself, significant political decisions. Taking these decisions requires strong and visionary leadership, the kind of leadership provided by Nelson Mandela, for example. But they also depend on the ability of marginalized communities to exert influence over policy making, to be part of a truly inclusive, deliberative democracy. Empowerment of those living in poverty is both a critical driver of the fight to end poverty, and it is one of the most important measures. The right investments in economic and social infrastructure, combined with legislative and regulatory measures supporting basic rights, rights to decent work, to gender equality, to ownership and control over individual and collective assets, and to influence in economic governance. They are important building blocks of economic empowerment. They will improve on the terms on which poor people engage in markets and will make economic growth more inclusive and more effective in reducing poverty. Such measures cannot be just an add-on to a sustainable economic development agenda. Climate scientists warn us about tipping points beyond which climate change becomes catastrophic. Who is to say that there are not social tipping points beyond which governance failures become self-perpetuating? The rise in inequality is a direct consequence of poorly regulated markets. But we should remind ourselves, all of us, that inequality is not inevitable. Neither is poverty. And it is possible to meet the needs of societies and then go on to deal with what some people present as the insatiable wants of society. I have said it on many occasions in my speeches that we need to re-legitimize and revitalize public policy. We must sustain the public world. We must readdress again the role of the state. And this means that we must reinvest governments and the political process with the duty and responsibility to define social objectives for the economy. This is the only way in which states and governments can have the ability to make a real social contract with their citizens and deliver on it. It is the road to the citizen becoming the participatory expert in decisions affecting his or her life. Those countries that have made most progress on the Millennium Development Goals, for example, are countries where governments have taken this role. In defining the post-2015 development framework next year, we must recognize this as a fundamental role for all governments and as a critical success factor for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. You, the young, educated people of South Africa, represent something that is very precious. It is a great privilege in any society to be in a university as a student or to take on the responsibility of being a university teacher. Well, we are there, after all, to give witness in the world in which we teach. And to you and your generation will fall the role of sustaining and leading the new South Africa as it moves forward from its youth to its prime. And I want to wish you well on your own journey in this wonderful country, blessed with so much potential and with a great future ahead of it. But it is, we have an Irish phrase, is fisca kela awara nadini. It is in the shadow of the other that we live, that the people live. I think it is very important that you take that responsibility of being able to work for the collective rather than for simple individualistic advancement. I want to thank you for the opportunity that you've given me to meet with you and talk with you here today. You have, in the conversations I've had, inspired me and convinced me that the links between South Africa and Ireland are not a matter of history alone. They matter to both of our peoples now as we face common challenges in the years to come. But for yourselves, it is an opportunity to make of everything you do something emancipatory. And I wish you well in your efforts to bring a new Africa, and in doing so bring a new world into being that will be truly interdependent and where we may be able to speak of a globalization of concern for all of our people and our fragile planet. Thank you very much.